Our third and last speaker for today's panel is Theresa. Theresa Reimann-Dubbers is a German artist investigating the technological environment. Interested in the genealogies of technologies, she examines the definitions and assumptions that forms the basis of the objects and systems that facilitate, shape, and mediate our existence in the world. She studied at Berlin University of the Arts in the New Media class of Joachim Sauter, and the Cole Parsons in Paris, Royal College of Art in London, and KMG in Tokyo. Her work has been shown internationally at Ars Electronica, Science Gallery Dublin, Lodz Design Festival, ECCV, Focus, Inside Festival, Transmediale, and CTM for Spiel, East of Elsewhere, and NIPS. So please welcome Theresa.
And thank you, Tomas, for that introduction. And thank you very much for the invitation to speak here. It's a real honor to be here. And I've found it really, really fascinating to listen to so many interesting people speaking about their work and to have conversations over the last few days. So thank you. Could I have the lights? Thank you. My presentation is called Borderline Speculation. The borderline here is an imaginary line somewhere between the human realm and that of machines. It is a speculation, meaning the formation of a theory without firm evidence. The title also functions when abbreviated to borderline spec. Spec, specification, a set of documented requirements. What is the borderline spec here? What are the requirements to pass through the border from the human realm into that of machines? I want to look at this borderline, to examine the border as filter, to observe what packages arriving at the border meet the requirements and pass through, and to see the packages that are left behind, the residue. Residue formed of things rejected, unavailable for learning. Why are things rejected or unavailable for learning? This is a very big and complex question for which I do not have an answer. I will, however, take a step back from the spec of this particular borderline, this machine learning curriculum, to first examine the notion of curriculum without machine. For example, what is my curriculum? My own experience of learning as human in the world. What things do I learn? What things do I reject? What things are unavailable to my learning? It's much easier for me to ask these questions of myself rather than of intelligent machines, mainly because I think I understand myself a little bit, but intelligent machines, I know that I understand very little. I actually don't understand most of the things I encounter in my day-to-day life. In an age where data is gold, documentability is a precondition of existence. The idea of not understanding, uncertainty, not having all the information is crippling, is to be less able. However, this persistent lack of understanding can also be seen as constructive. It has led to my equally persistent questioning and examining of things through my work, where the not understanding is a potential space for action. In my work, the subsequent action is my research. It manifests itself in objects or installations. The process is divergent, intuitive, non-exhaustive, and perhaps most importantly, it does not lead to answers. One such process was the development of my piece, AI Messianic Window, 2 years ago in January 2017. It was the first time I became aware of a sudden eruption of this thing that is artificial intelligence into my immediate surroundings, into mainstream discourse. I heard BBC News discussing culturally aware robots for the NHS in the UK. Chatbot Tay turned sour on Twitter. The unavoidable need for regulation was widely discussed. Researchers at Harvard and MIT acted to form the Governance and Ethics of Artificial Intelligence Initiative. Even behind the walls of the Vatican, the Catholic Church appeared unwilling to remain in the dark. The Pontifical Academy for Sciences held a conference in which Stephen Hawking and Demis Hassabis, amongst others, address the power and limits of artificial intelligence. I observed these occurrences. What amazed me most was this thing of artificial intelligence cropping up in these very abstract, subjectively exercised, but universally impactful situations: religion, culture. Two humans may cast their eye upon the same artifact, the same architecture of worship, but what they perceive may be worlds apart. A subject's gaze is a lens comprised of accumulated experiences as human in the world. I began to ask myself questions. What is the composition of the lens through which an AI perceives the world? How does an AI gain access to non-universally defined, intangible, and complex human concepts? I delegated the questions to my own experience of learning and asked, how did I first gain access to such a thing as religion? It is a nuanced and highly complex human concept. Understanding of it is subjectively constructed from an early age and shaped continually by subsequent experiences and decisions. I could never see or touch or smell or taste religion. Without sensory experience of the thing, school teachers who were following a curriculum taught me with texts and images. I learned to match the word Messiah to images of a bearded, long-haired man clad in robes and sandals. This access, a training through images, is also available to artificial neural networks. So I played teacher, a mediator of the given curriculum, together with a programmer because my code literacy is limited. I trained a DC GAN with images of the Messiah and placed the generated images back into a sacral and didactic context. A stained glass window. Stained glass windows are not there for people to see out of, or even to let light in. Their purpose instead is to direct and control the viewer's gaze. This window directs gaze towards the learning outcome, a knowledge object. Fleshy, multi-limbed representations comprised of the architecture of the DC GAN, my personal associations, and the labeled images of paintings of Jesus available on Wiki Gallery. A gaze directed towards is a gaze directed away from elsewhere, away from other visual representations of such a figure, away from the existence of messianic figures in other religions. Most significantly, it disregards those whose reality does not fit the learning architecture, figures of religions in which iconography is blasphemous. Within the limited framework of my project, figures in non-image format are not available for learning. They do not contribute to the knowledge object. With this project, I'm examining a knot. I don't presume to untangle it, only to study its structure, to see what the knot connects and strengthens, and to see what it obstructs and hides. The reality of artificially intelligent networks learning is a messy tangle to me, but one that I'm involuntarily entangled in. So it makes sense to enter the tangle, to confront myself with some of the many questions lurking in its layers, the many opportunities for bias, the construction of a curriculum, what represents a concept, what is the training data. I look for questions, because questions expose the array of answers that could have been, and hint at why they were not to be. These divergent and intuitive investigations are not traditionally productive. Art, I think, does not concern itself with answers, but with questions and action. So I probe into things that I have no knowledge of, with no agenda other than to go after that which confuses me most, to produce objects or installations that somehow embody this particular character of obscurity I find within the object of study. The artwork is elusive, contradictory cloudiness that occupies physical space. I will now embark on a walk through the field of learning as I have experienced it. I attended school in Germany and then in England, school as a place of learning. I learned things about the world, about myself and the world, and how to read the world. I learned to read the Roman abstract marks on a page became letters with corresponding sounds. Sequences of letters became words that described specific things in the world. This I learned by repeating the forms and the sounds of each letter, by repeatedly attaching letter sequences to the corresponding thing in the world until internalized. The thing plus the label, a hybrid, knowledge. Other things I learned more intuitively. If I cut finger with blade, finger will hurt, and pain is not nice. Less repetition was needed to learn this. So through feedback from my body, I learned how to avoid bodily pain and maximize pleasure. Through feedback from school teachers, I learned how to avoid punishment and receive praise. I adjusted my behavior accordingly. Labels are key to learning. Much of the world in which we humans act is intangible, is abstract. We don't have sensory responses to many things that govern our everyday behavior. Response is not innate. Behavior must be learned. Learning with labels. Label is metadata that adds properties and qualities to a phenomenon. I can read and respond to these properties and qualities. I can internalize the relationship between phenomenon and label and call upon it with sufficient confidence when prompted. A learnt response. Learning according to label, according to the availability of labeled things. A curriculum is a specification. It prescribes, and thus makes available a set of labeled things. The word curriculum stems from the Latin for fast chariot, a course, or the act of running. It's about a set path. It's about competing for a common goal. Teaching authorities determine course and goal of a curriculum. They decide what is available for learning, what things are assigned with what labels. I learned from specific textbooks with the occasional educational video. The input was words, images, and diagrams. My learning process was then the repeated answering of questions until pattern internalized. The success of internalization was then tested in exams, with an examiner as discriminator, marking right from wrong. Upon concluding the British A-level curriculum, I was able to label components of a eukaryotic cell on a standardized diagram and cite the significance of interstitial fluid in the maintenance of cells. The world is divided into core subjects. Subjects branch into subtopics. Each topic branch ends in a set number of enduring, indivisible facts. Arborescent, a tree as knowledge object. This is the product of mainstream Western education, a system born in the Christian church of the Middle Ages. It was delegated to state control with the Prussian education model in the early 19th century. A motive is said to have been to eliminate disobedience in Prussian soldiers. Motives, and therefore curricula throughout the world, are diverse, with equally diverse knowledge objects as products. Montessori, for example, although also European in origin, is a method that deviates from the mainstream curriculum. It was created by Maria Montessori at the turn of the 20th century in accordance with her understanding of the world. Education as means for sustained world peace. Human harmony maximized through a child's rich inner development. On the course towards this particular goal, the child encounters a different set of things with different labels that have been made available for learning. Institutional learning is a field. The field has entry gates through which not every human can pass. If admitted, a set path leads human away from gate towards central goal, but the walker can stray. A mere turn of the head will tell her that the field is finite. A fence marks the end. Beyond the fence, the terrain continues. It is comparatively messy. Earth is churned up. No paths are visible. No signposts. There are holes in the ground. I call this terrain unlearning. I studied at an art university in Berlin and found myself walking on this terrain. Things I produced and phenomena I encountered were labelless. They were not authoritatively marked right or wrong, desirable or undesirable. I was confused. I didn't know how to classify things. No classification without externally assigned labels. The feedback loop was broken. If feedback through labels was no longer an option, I had to base my response to things on something other. Intuition, sensing, feeling, observing, touching, holding, uncovering, turning up the earth, excavating, examining what is beneath, roots, systems, rhizomes. So unlearning relies on and exercises sensing, following scent. It is diffuse, divergent, rhizomatic. The strange things and systems we humans create, however abstract, have causes, roots. The thing we see above ground is a situational projectile. It is grown out of and maintained by the interconnected web of nodes and vessels obscured from our view. I believe the accelerating rate of change in the world is apparent to many. We apprehend the complexity of today to be a mere factor of that of tomorrow. I also believe we have an urgent responsibility to continually unearth and contemplate the roots and rhizomes that structure the earth upon which we construct. This deconstructed terrain is very different to my previous experience of learning, in which the field of learning is a cultivated landscape, a cultured landscape. It is visible, above ground, comprised of paths and routes and markers. The field is one of clarity, correctness, categories, discipline. Its paths lead to expert knowledge. This is knowledge that must be built up over time. It holds significant amount of power. The creation of expert knowledge is a communal practice. Joint definitions and shared high-level understanding are characteristics. Convergent, conferring, conference, knowledge without gaps, knowledge without holes. The comparatively unruly hole-digging practice of unlearning, of digging without a map, without apparent agenda, churning up and turning up of matter to reach roots and rhizomes, obscures any path and buries markers. The path to expert knowledge is obscured. Expert knowledge cannot be reached. I am not on a path to expert knowledge. I do not relay things authoritatively, reliably, or repeatably. Machine learning is a complex field of immense expertise, of higher knowledge. Only upon convergence of remarkable levels of expertise can things of such complexity emerge. It is not something I can assume access to, not something I can hope to relay. But this thing, machine learning, exists in the same world that I do. It occupies space, so I can access the space around the object of study. Examining the space around a thing, the negative space, begins to reveal the thing. The space around machine learning is accessible to me as non-expert. In speaking of the object and its surrounding space, I'm speaking of the figure-ground relationship, object and background, sound and the silence that surrounds it, cell and the fluid that preserves it, positive space, negative space. These zones are interdependent. They define each other, one ending where the other begins. Object and non-object share an outline. Exploring the peripheries of the object causes the non-object, that which it is not, to materialize. The non-object is the space between things, between labels. It's a diffuse space, a space that I, as an artist and also as human in the world, am incredibly interested in. It is the potential space I referred to at the beginning, a fluid, a labelless space that connects nodes. I think of it as the necessary empty, a breathing space. It is the relation between things, a connective space, fluid connective tissue. It carries and supplies and supports. The interstitial fluid sustains. It defines positive spaces, labeled things, knowledge objects, defines solids. A filter collects solid for transfer, learning as filter, machine learning as filter, filtered at the borderline, with a diffuse as residue not transferred. Fluid residue seeps out of future's construction. Yet our world is increasingly acknowledging its fluid foundations. On the other side of the borderline, solids are collecting. Solids asphyxiated in vacuums instead of bathing. Absence of solution, erosion. Dehydrated solids with frictionate outlines, aligned. Thank you.
So first of all, thanks a lot, the three of you. It was great. I'm going to try to ruin it now. There's a lot of I have a lot of questions, and luckily for me, I have you guys around for a couple of days, so I'm going to torment you. But there is a thing that I saw in the three presentations that I see as explorations of our relationship to these automated processes as human beings that are in a receiving end, so to speak, of a certain power asymmetry. In the first two presentations, there was something that struck me as incredibly interesting, which is the role that people can play, kind of like a manual labor that is part of the process of automated data processing, and also part of the process that automated data processing can entail or can trigger. That sounds, for example, in the crowdsource intelligence system, that is actually what is happening now directly for example, in China, the social credit, where there are people whose job is to do this kind of like community surveillance and then report it, and that is fed into the social credit processes. So your project that may seem like kind of like a futuristic thing, actually it's kind of like a remaking, so to speak, of processes that are happening now. You just mentioned a few minutes ago in this exploration of the negative space of machine learning, and I think that is extremely poetic and beautiful, but also perhaps neglects or ignores that exploration of negative space is always performed in a role or in a position of power asymmetry, that you're being forced and constrained and guided and directed to certain possible patterns of exploration that actually are functional to the structural asymmetries that these systems entail or crystallize. So the question is for the three of you, is how do you see the role of this of manual labor in the future, in the near future, or actually today, within these processes that crystallize certain structural asymmetries or certain structural inequalities, and what you guys think that people can do to escape those prescribed processes, if that would be desirable.
Yeah, this is interesting to me in terms of my dissertation, because I'm specifically looking at intelligence analysts and their practices. And one of the things that I noticed is this lack of critical reflection on those practices. So my, I guess, general orientation is like that of Philip Agri or Donald Schoen, that I would propose a critical technical practice. And I think part of what we can do as artists in raising these questions and showing people, exposing how these systems are developed, is to show some of the assumptions that are there, and so that people are not necessarily susceptible to just receiving these asymmetrical understandings, or just being, recipient to these asymmetrical power relations that you're talking about, but really take agency in being able to reflect on what they're doing and how they're contributing to things. So it's not just a black box that's something that, that you don't completely understand, but that you can potentially intervene in. And that's been really important to our work as artists, is actually engaging in these things to understand them in a really material way, so that they're not just completely abstract.
Yeah, and I'd also add that I think in terms of the labor that goes into them, there's this push from both ends to hide it, So on the one end, when you're presented with like a machine learning classifier, they don't talk about the people that make the corpus for the classifier. But at the other end, you also have people making data, and this is, I mean, you could call it unpaid labor or whatever. Sometimes it just happens because you're carrying around a device or whatever. But and there might actually be more work that goes into not making that data. But that's interesting to think about too. But yeah, I think a big part of what we're trying to do with the Crowdsourced Intelligence Agency and Public to Sentiment is to sort of show that process, and it's probably more overt in the CSIA, but with Public to Sentiment, I'm actually trying to get the attention of regulators and show them that, like, it's not Public to Sentiment that can only do this. I mean, this is something that brokerages do all the time to make money. They just don't make a website and show people that they're doing it because it's illegal for that, because they're making money off of it. But, yeah.
So there's another question the burning question that I can help to ask, which is triggered also by what Theresa just said of the reaction. You said at the beginning of your presentation that there was a reaction of certain religious group, I think it was the Catholic Church, on this whole idea, a philosophical idea of artificial intelligence and how it relates to more spiritual concepts. And that reminded me of an automaton from the 15th century that a Spanish king wanted. He had his son was sick. I'm going to make the story very short. So he promised to God that if there was a miracle and he would save his kid, he would pray I don't know how many times. So then, in order to pay that, and the kid was cured, in order to pay that, he commissioned an automaton that would pray for him. So it was this kind of like delegation of this spiritual process that sounds, from certain point of view, sounds ridiculous. From another point of view, it does not sound more ridiculous than actually praying. And for a third point of view, we do these things of delegation into certain tools or into certain mediums, some activities, which is something that is natural. So where we draw the line of what is ridiculous or what is actually a natural delegation of certain cognitive process is a blurry frontier. So my question would be, how do you see in the future that relationship between delegation of things that we think of very personal, like for example complaining against a certain company, to an automated process? How do you see that in the future, in expanding into other realms, which is, I think, related to the things we've been discussing here, also in terms of automated art production or art curation, but in any other human activity? Any thoughts of that?
I was just going to say, I think a lot of maybe everyday things are already being delegated, and there's also a choice of what do you delegate when you say complaining, because we complain a lot, so maybe you something will complain for you, or it's an automated process. But then if these are things that are a physical process and they have some kind of like bodily release, and that's their purpose, or praying, that doesn't produce anything, doesn't produce an object at the end of it as such that the object wouldn't change. It's the process, you're delegating a mere action. I think that's an interesting thing, because then why is the action still necessary if it's not you processing it through your own body? And I think that sometimes there's a disconnect between why are we doing these things and why do they exist, and that then maybe when it's been delegated, when it kind of then hangs out in the digital space, and it's and then you see thank you, and then maybe you have that reflection back on this now menial act, but menial because it's no longer situated in your physiology. I don't know if that's exactly where you're getting at, but I think that's an interesting thing to...
No, I'm not getting at anything particular. So we have a few minutes more, and even though it's very tempting to hold the conversation, I'd like to open for questions to the public. Gentleman there, do you have mics? No, gentleman there.
So I thought the presentation was very cool. I love the use of video that showed your installation for the CSIA there. It was very cool. Anyway, the question I had was specifically around that, was you see a lot of stuff that's being passed around in memes and graphical content nowadays. And so if someone doesn't put alt text on it and it's just, you know, I'm going to wage jihad against the U.S. and it's a bloody knife and it's just a picture. How does you know, what are they gathering on us that's visual now? Like how does the stuff that you're researching play into memes, basically, which are the new thing, I suppose, or not so new thing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, the CSIA is focusing, you know, solely on text. So if it's metadata about an image, it's still in text form and using natural language processing and things like that. And we haven't really explored anything with image recognition, but of course.
Yeah, it's not recognizing the image, but it is part of the corpus. So if it can detect the same exact image. I see this with web links. So web links become part of it too. So if there's like a link that's determined to be a threat and it's passed around again and again, that'll put you on the list. Also, if you're labeled as, say you make a tweet with an image and you're labeled as a threat, it would also get your geolocation and things like that, and that becomes part of how they identify what is and isn't a threat.
Yeah, and for our, specific practice-based expertise that we developed in this project, we were really honing in on one aspect of it because it is big data, because there are so many different processes that are coming together. I think that would be a worthwhile other project to explore, is to just focus on image analysis.
Can I let me follow up with that just real quick? Do you think the different governments have software that's looking at images in the same way you're looking at text or they're looking at text?
I would say yes. I mean, we know that they're doing facial recognition, and that same technology can be applied to, of course, still images. If you think about like the CAPTCHA that people are dealing, anytime you're on social media or you're trying to log into a website, that is a corpus that's being developed for machine learning algorithms to understand the images that are there. So that is definitely being developed, and people, this large amount of labor is actually building this in a crowdsourced way, so that the technology is definitely there.
Well, if you ever have the question, if the question ever is this information being used for certain surveillance, yes. You know the answer. It's an automatic process of using new data. One thing that I would like to put in everybody's mind also, there's this idea I've been working on, which is indirect surveillance, which is data that is gathered through the use of organizations or devices or structures that belong to somebody else. So, for example, now in this is I'm very interested in Chinese social credit, also being based in Hong Kong makes a lot of sense, and they potentially they're planning to use a lot of information that one would not think that is related to social credit. For example, who are your friends in social media, or what movies you watch on your television at home at 3 a.m. instead of being sleeping, which would be better for your social credit. And then one tends to think that as an isolated process in China, for example, but then they're gonna be you may be somewhere else, let's say in Germany, and you may be using the services of a company that belongs to a corporation that belongs to China, that also will integrate the data that you're generating indirectly into this more sophisticated, more general machine of surveillance. So going back to your question, the answer is always yes, and it's actually more complex and more mosaic that you could imagine at first.
Thank you for that discussion. That was amazing. My research is similar. I'm really trying to define concrete strategies for obfuscation for marginalized groups or groups that don't necessarily have sort of like real-time access to digital technologies, yet they do play a large role in the asymmetrical sort of status of commodifying their information and data for online networks. My question is to both of you, actually, Jennifer and Derek. You may be familiar, may not, but California just passed the new law that took effect in January 1st, which basically sort of penalizes anyone that uses a bot or bot type system, and they use the term bot pretty broadly to peddle products or influence outcomes of elections, local or federal. And so I'm just wondering whether, like, as an artist and as a creative type, creating strategies to counter data surveillance, and now the sort of legal state, and one would imagine that other states might start adopting these kinds of rules, their goal seems to be promising in trying to protect consumers, but simultaneously are counter to the efforts of artists trying to find creative tactics. What kind of strategies do you think you may sort of deploy to sort of deal with these kinds of issues legally, perhaps? Anyway, it's a hypothetical, but I mean, this is a new law that just took effect in California. So if your project were to be displayed in California, potentially both your sort of app that you have on your phone for bringing down stock prices, and then your joint project for sort of changing or modifying sort of like tweets based on threat level, could potentially be consumed within this broad definition that the state of California has defined as a bot. So anyway.
I was not familiar with that. I didn't realize that happened, but.
Yeah, that's interesting. With public dissentiment, it would always be a swarm of people. The information is put there through an automated process, but it would never be distributed on social media without a person pushing the button. So that could be, I guess, in terms of artistic strategies, if you have a willing group of people, you could always just use a swarm. You could use Mechanical Turk, something like that.
And the same would be true for the CSIA, that what we're gathering in order to build the corpuses, because we don't have access to the training corpuses, is something that isn't actually automated, but we're evaluating it just to show people how this is happening. So it's not something that's made to manipulate. It's actually made as an educational tool. One thing that I'm really interested in and have only recently started exploring is this idea of algorithmic inclusion, and that could be potentially related to this in that this idea of inclusion in a database is very different in different contexts. So in the context of surveillance, what does it mean to be excluded from a facial recognition corpus? And in what ways could that actually be a strength, a countervalence position to not be able to be registered, as opposed to wanting to be included in a particular facial recognition technology so that you can have your camera focus on your face. So there's also this interesting conflict between what happens when you have the same kind of content agnostic technology that's being applied to something that's used in marketing or some type of a product, versus how that can then be manipulated for surveillance. So I think that there's another interesting relationship there that I've only recently started thinking about in a legal sense. But yeah, that's a really good question, and I didn't know about that. I need to look into that. That could be a potential interesting project to do too. Thank you.
Hello, so my question is actually a little more general than Triton's, but similar. You had mentioned at one point, Derek, in your presentation that you made a decision to avoid putting your users at risk. I didn't catch the details, and I hope you'll explain that in a little more detail. But then the question is, are you putting yourself and your users at legal risk, and are you aware of the breadth of the legal risks that your work is exposing you to?
Yeah, so I actually looked into that quite a bit when I was making it. So one of the precursors to the project is a project by the Institute for Applied Autonomy called TextMob, programmed by Tad Hirsch. And that actually, the source code for that actually became the first version of Twitter. He open sourced it, and so it's an interesting story to follow as well. But so TextMob used SMS messages to help protesters of the 2004 Democratic and Republican National Conventions avoid the police, so they could, say, don't go down this road. He was subpoenaed by the NYPD, and they took all of the user data from TextMob to try to track down the protesters and arrest them after the fact. And so that was actually what informed my decision to not collect any data. So if I'm ever served a subpoena, it's just not there. In the US, it's this is also why every story that's generated is based on, or every social media post that's generated is based on an actual story, as this is free speech. This isn't misinformation. It's saying things that actually happened, and so within the US, you're okay. I'm not sure about everywhere in the world, but I'll be okay.
Yeah, hi. So I'm going to try to fit in two questions if I can for Jennifer and Derek. So first is question is about the notion of threat, right? In whether in these specific projects or your research in general, and what does the state power, the surveillance state mean by threat or national security? Because if we just look at U.S. policy and actions, what they mean by national security doesn't mean the safety and security of the people of the nation. I mean, we know that. I mean, feel free to disagree. I think we know that. So, because I think there's an assumption here in that they're looking for, and I'm not, so again, I'm sort of speaking broadly in the surveillance state, not perhaps the specific human agents, right, that in the project, in the NSA or wherever, but that so in other words, the threat might be not so much a terrorist, let's say, but the threat to what they define as national security, right? So I'm just wondering if you can, first of all, how relevant is that difference for you, for the project, for your research? And so maybe just sort of talk about what that means. And so that's the first question. The second one, I guess it's a little more for Derek, but really for both, is I'm sure you're aware of like ArtMark and the Yes Men and some of the stuff they've done. And maybe you could just speak about the relationship between, let's say, low-tech techniques, like their sort of performative. There was I know one project where that was had to do with the Bhopal disaster, where they tanked the stock price as well, simply by just going on BBC and relying on journalists not checking their sources, that kind of thing. So maybe just talk about sort of that type of work and just, let's say, again, low-tech direct action versus high-tech.
Yeah, I don't want to really speak for you, but I know that with the Dow Chemical, Bhopal, BBC, Tactical Media project, that was something that really inspired you to do the project.
Yes, they were actually investigated by the SEC for that. To see if they made money on it. Interestingly, it hadn't occurred to them that they might actually impact the stock price. But what happened with that is that Dow's stock tanked, but then when it came out that it was a hoax, it actually went way higher than it was before. So they could have bought low and sold way high, but they didn't. But yeah, I think that there's, so we actually studied under Steve Kurtz of Critical Art Ensemble. So my feelings about tactical media are very complicated. I love it on one hand, but I also think that tactical media serve to be like a type of pen testing for the state apparatus. Like you find this area that you can intervene in, and you do it, and you're like, look at my art project, and the next thing you know, that area is closed down, and you can't do it again. It's like this temporary space that now, when something that's actually meaningful happens, you can't occupy. And so that was one of the things that I was really considering when I made public to sentiment. Like I said, this is something that's being done by actual traders. And so what I would love is for my project to somehow come to the attention of regulators or Congress or something like that, for them to be like, you can't do this. Because if they can stop me from doing it, then they can go after the people that are already doing it and making money off of it. But I don't know if that answered what you're asking.
Yeah, and then I guess to touch on the threat part of it, which is something we haven't really dealt with, I could say a lot about that, especially in relation to Mosaic theory in FOIA law and beyond. This notion of not allowing information to get out because people could construct a damaging picture is something that also prevents the general public from having oversight over these types of control, social control and surveillance and torture and mass arrests and all of these things. And one of the things that I spent a fair amount of time studying is the FBI files of artists and other intellectuals who exercised the freedom of speech and then were investigated by the FBI. And one of the main obsessions I found in these files was information. That was like the thing that they kept obsessing over. And there was an experiment in 1982 that was conducted by the FBI called Operation Mosaic, where they found that FOIA files that had been released into the public domain could be pieced together to reveal things that didn't want to be seen. And these are really seen as threats to the status quo, but they, from another angle, could actually really benefit the public to understand what kinds of investigations are happening. And even to go back to Steve Kurtz, who was investigated as a bioterrorist for having a bioart lab in his house. I don't know if people are familiar with that case. It's a really fascinating case. I actually spent 4 years trying to get the FOIA files for that through a lawsuit, and hit so many roadblocks. And there's no way that what I was trying to do with that could have been a threat. It was something that was a closed case, but this ends up getting used. This idea of a threat to national security becomes this guise for withholding information from the public, and I find it's a really important question, I think, that you have, and point of tension between, yeah.
You should say that you did get the files, so you know that they weren't a threat.
I did.
Just embarrassing.
Right, and it ended up being this prosecutor that really wanted to make a name for themselves, so they kept trying to push this case, and this was under the Bush administration, so they didn't want to let it go, even though they had to drop all the charges. It was just bioart. There was nothing. No, that was the scientists that they were working with, because they were shipping bacteria that was harmless. But no, they dropped all the charges for Kurtz. Yeah. That's a good question. Thanks.
Great panel. I have a question for Theresa. Your machine learning stained glass window, it struck me that, in the context of your overall talk and some of the talks we've had at the conference about machine learning, machine learning often aims at a normativity of achieving the ultimate sort of goal of reproducing the world with perfection, so that we cannot discriminate between reality and creation, or we cannot discriminate between the original artwork and its reproduction. But there's also this other dimension to it, which we've seen and was explored in some of Memo's work on. I'm thinking of Anne's work with the tulips, where it's about also it's rather than normative. It's about dispersion and about heterogeneity. And your work seemed to do that with the Christ. The normative Christ figure in your stained glass window. I wondered whether you had done other work of this kind, and whether you had reflections on this dimension of machine learning as a medium of artistic exploration.
That's a really good question. I hadn't done any work with machine learning or AI before that, and it was for that reason that I wanted to kind of go through that process and to see what questions I would be confronted with and what my kind of default reaction to those questions would be. So then it came to, okay, well, you must, train it with images, and so you have to have a set of training data. And so I thought, oh well, I've read, other papers, or other people have, got their training data from Wikigallery or Google or ImageNet, and so I thought, well, I'll do the same. Let me look for the images that I'm looking for, and then I saw, well, all I can find 20,000, circa 20,000 tagged images of paintings of Christ, and these are paintings that most of them were done before the turn of the 20th century. So there's a particular style. They're paintings that are well known because they're on the internet somewhere. They've been documented and labelled with year and artist, and so that to me was really interesting because I kind of, through the whole process, went through the path of least resistance to just see what comes together, what comes out of it, and how, with me kind of, a bit passively sat at the steering wheel. And that for me was interesting because it was not a way that I'd worked before, because I always, I used to very much finalize my concepts and then go into production. And here this was very much a reversal, because even though I'd had certain assumptions before I started, those were all overturned, and I really learned from the network I was working with, and the questions I was confronted with. And that's actually now led me to, I think, a more feedback practice with my medium. I'm not working with neural networks anymore at the moment. I'm working with very haptic material, clay and things like that, but it's kind of opened up this more discursive process. So if that answers the question.
A very simple question. Beautiful work and beautiful presentation. Thank you, all of you. Amazing presentations today. I'm curious about the Messianic Window as well, and I'm looking at your website, and is it basically transparencies that are put onto a window?
It is at the moment. I'm having it produced this year. I'm talking to stained glass window manufacturers in one in Munich and in London, and trying to get the money together to produce it. So it will exist as an installation in a room with kind of a big altarpiece, and then panels leading up to it. And I'm also thinking about using some of the kind of earlier epochs in the training process to have the artifacts and these, the aesthetic that everyone knows of GANs that's, a bit segmented, to have bits of that maybe go into the early panels as well, because I think that being done by very skilled craftsmen and women, being replicated, this very machinic aesthetic, I think is going to be really fascinating. So it will be produced this year.
Great. And one more question for you, and then a quick question for you guys as well. Your delivery of the last piece was beautifully delivered, very poetic and really mesmerizing. And I'm wondering if you're reading a lot of poets, and your descriptions on your site are all very kind of poetic in a way. Your writing is poetry. Are you reading a lot of poetry?
I'm actually not. I think it's for lack of defining or solidifying, and I think that's really something I really struggled with, because I often found myself, if I couldn't finish the sentence or couldn't describe the thing in its entirety, or what I thought was its entirety, then I wouldn't say the thing at all. And that I found that really restrictive, and in order to overcome that, I've accepted that it's okay to talk divergently, to not have answers, and to leave things open. And I'm trying to really work that into the way I speak, so that reinforces the way I think also.
Very interesting. Thank you. And just a really quick question. I wondered if either of you thought that perhaps you're attending University of Buffalo and having affiliation with Steve Kurtz might have been perhaps the reason you were flagged at the border.
That is possible.
It certainly didn't help.
Yeah, and it actually got a lot worse once we got to Buffalo. I mean, I was approached quite a lot by various people that wanted me to be, especially once I started suing the Department of Justice for the files.
Oh, my.
So yeah, there was, but when I was in Los Angeles, there was actually quite a lot of intimidation of Occupy members there. We would be followed around by FBI agents that would take pictures of us, and this was because of our friends that were arrested at the encampment. So, for example, he had an MFA, and an FBI agent told him that he was considered a leader of the movement, which is funny because it was really described as a leaderless movement. That was one of the characteristics of it. But of course, intelligence agencies have this command and control structure, and they tend to kind of project that onto things that they see happening in the world. But yeah, I'm sure that was part of it. And an interesting kind of side note, the majority of people that sign up for the CSIA are intelligence agents. So lots of government contractors are in there.
They have military email addresses or Booz Allen.
Yeah. Or sometimes they'll call us, but they don't leave messages, but we'll see. It's like, oh, it's the FBI in Cleveland for some reason called us. Yeah, I'm sure that was part of it.
Steve always told me to call them back and see what they
Yeah,
want.
just see what they want. My next step that I'm going to do, and I actually have been talking about this with some journalists, so I'm always looking for different techniques if people have any, but I need to request my own FOIA file from the FBI, just knowing that I have one. And I have some techniques for how to get some inside information while I'm doing that. So if anyone has any thoughts on that, we can talk after this. But thanks, that's a great question.
While we wait for another question, I have one. So but also a lot of people are quite concerned with digital surveillance, and I am more and more thinking that the key part of that concern is the digital part, and not the surveillance. We have a very rich history, so to speak, of state surveillance. I don't know, we have the Stasi or the McCarthyism or the millions, literally millions of examples of very systematic and very fruitful surveillance that generated a lot of data. And perhaps the question would be, is there any ontological difference besides that now we have computers that can automate certain processes? And then if that is the only difference, then why is that a difference? Why do we care that much about delegating these surveillance processes onto computers, while perhaps we should be talking about the social conditions that generate this process?
Yeah, I think that the ontological question is really important when it comes to data. As I was talking about this notion of data as something that's raw, when of course there's this whole process of capturing things, what is going to be captured, and then how that changes our behavior, in order to want to be captured in a certain way to interface with a particular website, or your employer captures your activities in order to make sure that you're being efficient, and there's this Taylorist aspect of it as well. So I think that there's some hope in the sense that because data is captured and it's translated and it's not necessarily factual, it's a construction, there's also places for intervention because of that translation process. So you can, have false information, you can hide things in information because of that, and it's not an indexable trace, so.
Yeah, and I'd say it's probably preferable. I always think of it in terms of, Deleuze's society of control, and it's certainly better to be tracked than it is to be put in a prison and monitored by a literal panopticon. But I don't think it's. I don't know how to quite say this. I know what I think, but I'm not sure how to communicate it. If you understand the process of what's being captured and how it's being interpreted and translated, you actually have a lot more freedom than
you can evade it in certain ways.
Otherwise, and if you don't, then you're going to get stopped at the border, like we were. And in hindsight, it makes complete sense. These people were involved with Occupy, and now they're like with Steve Kurtz. Like, you should probably question them. And maybe they'll admit to something, or I don't know. But the reality is they didn't know why they were stopping us or what they were supposed to ask us, and we weren't doing anything wrong. We were very poor grad students. Yeah, so.
There's also this counter effect of self-censorship or self-control. If you know the rules, then you're going to force yourself to act in the prescribed way.
Exactly, and it's very easy. I mean, you can use like old techniques. So if you want to get around this type of surveillance, you just use code words. You know, they're scraping Twitter for people doing something wrong. And when I first made the surveillance system for Twitter and just opened it up to see, you know, what bad stuff I could find, I instantly found ISIS, because over in Syria they're saying whatever they want, and so of course it's terrible and it's being swept up. And what's interesting is when you find those like cases that you're not really sure, so it's like ISIS, Boko Haram, and then you're like, this might be a 13-year-old who's playing a video game and is upset with someone and threatening to DDoS them, or it could be like a legitimate threat, and it's like those in-between cases that we're interested in, because the people that know they're doing something wrong are going to be very careful about hiding it. It's the people that just don't know how it works that are going to, you know, like the British teenagers that were detained by the DHS and search for shovels, and, you know, like that's what we're trying to get at, is like be smart about it. And it seems like the only people that are really smart about it are the people that we actually want to catch.
I have one last question for Theresa. Which there's a lot of discussion, and we've seen presentations here about opening the black box of machine learning or explainable AI. And I as a scientist, I want to do it. At the same time, I sometimes feel that once you can explain what's going on, it stops being machine learning and it starts being human learning. And that there is a value on not understanding what the process that is going underneath, or on this implicit modeling that is non-human, because it's not, perhaps it's detecting patterns that we would not pay attention to. So your exploration of this negative space, which is something I still don't understand what it means, but I really like it. My question would be, what do you think about that? If you could understand perfectly how the GAN or the DCN worked, would your artwork be as good as it is now, or you think something is gone?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think it also, that relies on the thing, that being able to be explained perfectly in word form in a way that I can understand, and me not knowing exactly how, you know, these systems work. But I also think that not every aspect is describable or can exist in word form, because otherwise, you know, it would exist in solely words. And for me, I don't find that very important. What I find important is to form my own metaphors or ways of understanding that fit with how I see, how I perceive a chair in the room, how I perceive another human in the room. That's how I want to look at the system, and have enough access to it that I can, you know, perceive it as object in the room in order to have a personal experience of it and be able to speak about it in my words, because that's that may not be all the information, that may not be true to what it really is, but I think with something as complex as a artificial neural network, I think that a lot of people, or very few people, or maybe no one knows exactly what's going on inside of it, that I think being able to understand, fit it into your understanding of the world, I think that's what's important, and that's what was really lacking for me, and that was the reason for doing this project, and then to be able to speak about it in my own words, or to know how I stand positioned to it only in the very small scope that was my project.
Do we have time for the last question? We don't. So please help me thanking for an amazing panel.